Spiritual warfare is fundamentally about the conflict between two kingdoms. Whether you realize it or believe it or not, the Bible teaches that we are a part of a supernatural conflict where a hive mind of unseen beings, guided by a super intelligent malevolence, collectively observes humanity through a thin, preternatural veil, seeking opportunities to influence, impede, misdirect, and afflict. All right, what's up, everybody? Welcome back to the Tat2d Preacher Podcast. This is episode number 40. Hope you're all doing awesome today. And so in this episode, I want to look at the topic of spiritual warfare. Now, when I say that phrase, spiritual warfare, I'm sure a number of things typically will come to mind. But in this episode and in the episodes following this episode, I want to look at this topic of spiritual warfare, but from a different angle, a different perspective that I would go as far as to say isn't even on the radar of most Christians, most pastors, most churches. And so if you think about that, that is a pretty scary thought. That the reality that we are living in a spiritual war, a cosmic battle, that warfare is happening in the unseen realm, and the enemy is using strategies and warfare that most Christians aren't even aware of. And to me, that freaks me right out. And if we're honest, this is like the enemy has a free-for-all in the lives of most Christians, because he's doing stuff and using stuff that, again, most Christians aren't even aware that he's doing it or using it, and, using strategies on them. And so I want to address that issue. I want to expose a lot of it and just look at this familiar Christian topic just from a different perspective and angle. So that's where we're going in episode 40. Before we get there, again, I just want to quickly mention to everybody, if you haven't yet followed me, Instagram, TikTok, my handle is the Tat2d Preacher. The links will be in the description below. And also on YouTube, if you haven't yet subscribed to my channel, subscribe today. Pause this right now. Go to YouTube, subscribe if you're not watching this on YouTube right now. And also, if you haven't yet left a review on your favorite podcast platform, that would be awesome. Just click a little 5-star button there. Help a brother out. That would be amazing. So yeah, spiritual warfare. Here we go, episode 40. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the episode. Okay, so spiritual warfare. Now, in the opening, I read a quote from Dr. Michael Heiser from his book called The World Turned Upside Down, Finding the Gospel in Stranger Things. And I love the way he described spiritual warfare in that book, because he hits on a whole bunch of interesting parts to spiritual warfare, and he explains it in a way that I feel like often is just simply overlooked. And so he talks about how spiritual warfare is between two kingdoms. Well, it's pretty obvious. You have the kingdom of God and you have the kingdom of darkness, the kingdom of the enemy. But then he says this statement, and I'm going to read it again. He says that we are a part of a supernatural conflict where a hive mind of unseen beings, guided by a super intelligent malevolence, collectively observes humanity through a thin preternatural veil, seeking opportunities to influence, impede, misdirect, and afflict. And so that phrase there, guided by a super intelligent malevolence. See, oftentimes we don't really think of, when we think of the unseen realm and we think of, the kingdom of darkness, we don't really associate that with super intelligence. When we think of spiritual warfare, we think of being attacked. We think of darkness trying to perhaps destroy and to rob and to kill and to steal and to negatively affect people and things. But we often lose sight of the fact, or don't focus on the fact that they are super intelligent, that these beings have been around since before humanity existed. We see that in Genesis, we see that in Job, where it talks about how the sons of God, the angels, they were there at creation, that they were singing for joy, that they watched God do what he did. They watched God form man, form the world, create everything. So because they watched God create everything, right, they have a certain level of understanding of how our world works, of how things work that is beyond our capacity and our knowledge. And so they're super intelligent. And I think that that's an important thing to understand as we're going to dive into this episode and in subsequent episodes to come, when we're going to see things like, we're going to see how these beings in the unseen realm, on the kingdom of God's side and the kingdom of darkness side, both the good guys and the bad guys, they have this knowledge and understanding of how our world works, of how physics work, chemistry, biology, astronomy. They know the outworkings and the inworkings of our world in ways that we can't even comprehend. And so this is going to be important as we dive into this stuff. I wanted to focus on that because we have the super intelligent malevolence, and they are seeking opportunities to influence, impede, misdirect, and afflict. Now, when we think of being afflicted, we think of spiritual warfare, we just automatically assume, there's an enemy who wants to steal, kill, and destroy us. We quote that verse, and we typically think of the enemy doing these things by what? We are often tempted by the enemy. We think of the enemy trying to get us to do things that we know we shouldn't do, so tempt us to sin. We think of the enemy, trying to destroy relationships and families and marriages. We think of the enemy trying to divide and create church splits. And these are kinds of things that when we think of spiritual warfare, this is what comes to mind. But I want to suggest that there is a whole level, a whole other world of warfare that the enemy wages and acts upon, that most Christians aren't even aware of. It's not even on our radar, or just humanity in general is not even aware of. And so this is what I want to kind of highlight and focus on, because to me that's a super scary thought. Again, like how do you defend against a strategy, against a kind of warfare, if you don't even know how to defend it, if you don't even know that it's coming, if you don't even know that it exists? And so this is why I think this is a super important thing to talk about, and why spiritual warfare is way more intense and way more deep and way more just intense than we realize. And so to start off in this episode, I want to just talk about how spiritual warfare came to be. Like, when did it start? How did it begin? Like, how do we even have this cosmic battle? Because when God created everything was good. And so what happened? What caused this massive cosmic battle to take place that we as humans now are kind of a part of, caught in the middle of, and are feeling the effects of on a day-to-day basis. And so I want to describe this and lay this out in three different ways. I think there are three different ancient cosmic rebellions that have began what we know as spiritual warfare and have catapulted it and increased it to what we see and what we experience today as Christians. And so spiritual warfare has its origin in a rebellion of many angels against God, where Satan is seen as the prince of this world, leading an array of forces opposed to God. So the first rebellion in the massive, prolific fall of the devil and his cohort, devil and other angels. Now, there's a lot of debate. There's a lot of discussion of when that was. A lot of people will look to Revelation chapter 12, and they'll say this is where the devil fell with a third of his angels. And if you read the context of that particular verse, it's not talking about a primordial rebellion. It's just talking about the time of Jesus's birth. And so the context of that fall, of that rebellion, is around the birth of Jesus, not the ancient primordial rebellion. And so then people are like, okay, well then when else could he have fallen? And so I hold to the opinion, the minority opinion, the minority view of a pre-Adamic world where before the world of Adam and Eve, there was another world. And in that whole world, there was a whole bunch of stuff going on. And I think it was that world where the devil fell. And then a lot of people think that the devil and his angels fell along with Adam and Eve, that it was kind of like this joint rebellion that took place. But for this episode, we're not going to get into the specifics of when the devil fell with his angels, but just at the fact of just the event in general, no matter where you place it. Because it's interesting, if you read in Isaiah 14 and Ezekiel 28, right, it describes this massive fall from grace, from the devil and from angels. It talks about how, Lucifer was created as one of the, guardian cherubs, that he was covered in jewels and precious stones, that he reached this, high pinnacle of God's creation. I mean, he was one of the main dudes that guarded the throne of God. And so we see descriptions, again, in Isaiah 14 and Isaiah 28, but then we also see that at some point, whenever you want to put that, at some point, he looked upon the throne of God and was like, man, I want to be like God. I want to be worshipped. And it said that pride filled his heart. And as soon as he crossed the line of of desiring to take praise and take worship and take honor that only is due Yahweh, that only is due God, when that entered his heart, created this split. And so at some point, again, we don't know how the whole thing went down, but at some point, he wanted to ascend. God discovered it. God found it. God called it out. And then there was this massive rebellion where the devil was cast out along with a whole bunch of other angels. Again, we don't know if it was a third. We don't know if it was a quarter. We don't know if it was a fifth. We don't know how many, but there was this massive rebellion that took place where then the devil and these angels were thrown out of heaven. This was the separating factor between, instead of having a kingdom that was all good, this is where the kingdom of darkness was created. This was the beginning of the cosmic battle. You had the kingdom of God and the kingdom of darkness. So the next rebellion I want to look at that I think, really contributes to spiritual warfare and kind of, maybe took it to the next level is Genesis chapter 6. And I've talked about this ad nauseum on this podcast. But to quickly summarize, and why I think this is important, is that this is when, again, another group of angels, they're called watchers in the book of 1st Enoch. They're called sons of God in Genesis chapter 6, 1 through 4. When they came to earth and they mated with human women, creating a hybrid race called the Nephilim, part divine, part human. And when you follow this through and you start reading ancient Jewish literature in between, it's called the intertestamental period. So in between the time when the second temple was built and when the second temple was destroyed, that 500 years or so, a lot of stuff was being written. And when the ancient writers, the ancient Jewish Hebrew people, when they were looking at the story of the Nephilim, where they get demons from is they suggested that demons are the disembodied spirits of the Nephilim. Now, when they died, their spirits, because they were part divine and part human, they couldn't go either back up to heaven or down to Sheol where humans died. So they were kind of trapped on the earth and left roaming our world. And this is why you get into the idea of where demons, they love to possess people because they need host bodies to go into so that they can interact with our world. And so this is what the disciples, this is what Jesus, this is what the ancient Hebrews, this is where they get demons from. And so when we think of spiritual warfare, again, part of that is, having encounters with the demonic realm. And an ancient Jew, an ancient Hebrew would argue that this is where that whole demonic realm was created in Genesis 6. When the giants, these hybrid race, when they died, their spirits, and this is where we get the term unclean spirits from, when they died, they were left roaming, and this is who Jesus, the apostles, the disciples, the early church, this is who they are confronting in the New Testament. All those demonic encounters, all those demonic possessions, all of that are these disembodied spirits of the Nephilim that we are still dealing with today. And so I would argue, and a lot of other scholars would argue, that when people are talking about demons, people having demons, people seeing demons, people, having these crazy demonic encounters, they are encountering disembodied spirits of the Nephilim, that hybrid race of creature, that unclean spirit that was left, that God never created. This is who we're battling with. And so Genesis 6 kind of took that spiritual warfare component. So there was rebellion in heaven, Satan and his angels fell. Then we have Genesis 6, which is the creation of what we know as demons. And then the third rebellion that I want to look at is in Genesis chapter 11 with the Tower of Babel. Now, often we think of Babel, there was the story where God told humanity to be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth, spread around, don't just stay in one place. But what do we see in Genesis 11? That the whole world gathered together in the plains of Shinar. And so basically they gather together, which violate what God said, and they're trying to build a tower. And again, this is a whole other subject in and of itself, to build a tower, to reach to heaven, to get God to come down, basically violating everything that God had just said previously. And so then God comes down and he confuses their languages and basically forces them to spread across the earth. But what often gets overlooked in this story, that doesn't really get seen or talked about or connected with ever, is Dr. Michael Heiser calls it the Deuteronomy 32 worldview. And so in Deuteronomy chapter 32, verses 8 and 9, we read this. It says, when the Most High gave the nations their inheritance, when he separated the sons of mankind, he set the boundaries of the peoples according to the number of the sons of God. For the Lord's portion is his people, Jacob is the allotment of his inheritance. So in verse 8, we talk about when he separated the sons of mankind. When did this happen? When did God separate the sons of mankind? This is what happened at Babel. And so what we're reading here in Deuteronomy 32 is that when God separated the nations, he confused their languages. He pushed and he forced them to go abroad. What he did is because they rebelled, so for a time of discipline, he's like, all right, you all don't want to listen to me? Fine. I'm going to start over again with a new group of people. I'm going to give you over and put rulers over you for a time, and I'm going to start with my own people. And then in Genesis chapter 12, this is when God calls Abram, and this is when the nation of Israel starts. It says, the Lord's portion is his people, Jacob is the allotment of his inheritance. So God's like, I'm going to start my own people, but you all, I'm going to confuse your languages. I'm going to send you across the world, and I'm going to set the boundaries according to the number of the sons of God. And so what God does here is he takes part of his heavenly host, his heavenly council, and he puts over each one of the nations someone to, in a sense, be his representative, to lead them, to guide them, to direct them, to take care of them for a time while he creates his own people, his own inheritance for a time. Now, think of this. But what happens is that we read in Psalm 82 that these sons of God that God put over the nations, instead of being godly representatives for a time to steward them, to direct them, to lead them in a godly way, they in turn begin to elicit worship for themselves. They become corrupt, and this is where you get the cosmic battle where we see for the rest of the Old Testament, Yahweh versus the gods of the nations. So all the gods over all the nations, you have Baal, you have Osiris, you have all of these figureheads, Moloch, all of the gods that Israel is fighting, and the gods of the pagan nations are these sons of God that rebelled against Yahweh. This is the third rebellion. And so instead of being godly representatives, they elicit worship, become corrupt, they rebel against God, and this is where you get this massive conflict between Yahweh against the nations, Israel against the nations, Yahweh against the gods. And so this kind of took spiritual warfare and blasted it, globally, because now you have not only in the spiritual realm, but now in the physical world, the physical conflict. This is where the battle that's happening in the heavens begins to really influence humanity, begins to really affect people in real time and space. When you have, for the whole rest of the Old Testament, you have Israel fighting against all the clans, all the nations, battling it out, fighting against, because you have these other gods, lower G gods, that were a part of God's council, who rebelled, and instead of ruling for God on his behalf, became his enemy. And so these are the three rebellions where I think spiritual warfare was founded, was grounded, and what caused it to erupt, what caused it to, become an experience, an everyday experience for humanity. So you have the fall between Satan and his angels, the prolific first fall. You have Genesis 6, and that's the creation of demons. And then you have Genesis 11 and Babel, where God separates the nations. He puts them under these other parts of his divine counsel to rule them for a time. But then they ultimately rebel against God, start eliciting worship for themselves. And then this is where you get nation against nation, God's people against the world. You have the kingdom of darkness playing out in real time and space with real nations and real people. Now, again, some of you may not have heard that stuff before. especially the Deuteronomy 32 stuff. But this is where, again, all of that, the ancient mythology comes from. This is where you get all of those gods. This is ground zero. This is how they all came on the scene. This is why they are real beings. They are real entities. They're not just fictional characters that people just decided to create up once upon a time, but they were actually divine beings that were in the kingdom of God that ultimately rebelled against him. And through history, through culture, all over the world, there's different ethnicities, right? Different cultures, different belief systems, different names, but all of these beings throughout history, the names may have changed based on where people are, but ultimately it was the same entity. These were the fallen sons of God. So that's where spiritual warfare, I think, was birthed. Again, those three rebellions. Now, building upon that foundation of the birth of spiritual warfare, now let's make it personal now. Let's make it more practical, real time, real space. And so we have to understand that Satan and his angels, they are a well-organized, super intelligent army that desires to take humanity out, that desires to take you out, that desires to afflict, to impede, to misdirect, to do everything that they can possibly do to prevent you from encountering God, to prevent you from wanting to worship him, wanting to know him, to do whatever they can to basically destroy your life so that you will join their fate in eternal separation from God. Like that's the real mission and objective of the devil and his cohort. And so Paul says it this way in Ephesians 6 and in Colossians 1. He says, "For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the powers, against the world forces of this darkness, against the spiritual forces of wickedness in heavenly places." Now, this is Paul's way in the New Testament of describing what we just described previously with the Deuteronomy 32 worldview. Remember talking about how all the nations had gods in charge of them that began to elicit worship from them? This is where Paul gets that idea from. And so this is the New Testament way of talking about that. And Paul says how our struggle as humans, our battle, we're not fighting against people, but we're fighting against these principalities and powers, rulers in the heavenly places. That's where our war is. And so as humans, as people of God, our perspective has got to be not necessarily on people on a person-to-person level, but we need to have eyes in the unseen realm, an awareness of the unseen realm, and not get distracted by things of this world. Because behind all of that is that demonic influence that's taking place. Paul says in Colossians 1, "For he rescued us from the domain of darkness," that there is a domain of darkness that our world is in. The Bible calls the devil the prince of the power of the air. There's a domain of darkness. Think of it like a cloud. There's this dark cloud that's over our world, that over people in our world. And then when they're in this cloud, they are being influenced by what's happening in the heavenly realm. And so they are a well-organized, super intelligent army that want nothing more than to destroy you. Now let's read some more verses here. 1 Peter 5:8 says this, "Be of sober spirit, be on the alert. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour." Be of sober spirit. Be on the alert. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion seeking someone to devour. 2 Corinthians 10:3 says this, "For though we walk in the flesh, we do not wage battle according to the flesh. For the weapons of our warfare are not of the flesh, but divinely powerful for the destruction of fortresses." In 1 Thessalonians 2:18, Paul says this. He was speaking of himself, "For we wanted to come to you, I, Paul, more than once, and Satan hindered us." So Satan actually got in the way, prevented him from going from one place to another. In Luke 22, we see this, "Simon, Simon, behold, Satan has demanded," this is Jesus speaking, "Satan has demanded to sift you, men like wheat, but I have prayed for you, that your faith will not fail." So there's this personal, again, this personal attack from the enemy where he wants to take humanity out. He wants to, as John says, to steal, kill, and destroy. Now let's think about these verses. Let's think about that for a second. Because oftentimes we hear this so often and we become numb to it. But we've walked through this whole process so far of understanding that there's this cosmic battle taking place. There's a battle that's being waged that started way back in ancient times in heaven, and that's been playing out on earth in a whole bunch of different ways for thousands of years. And now we find ourselves on the scene here. And the mission hasn't changed. The devil prowls around looking for someone to devour. The kingdom of darkness, the domain of darkness, is looking to devour people. Now, again, when we think about how that happens, how that manifests, yes, it's through temptation causing us to sin. Could be through affecting our emotional states. We're talking about depression. We want to talk about mental health things. That's all in play there. We want to talk about rifts in families and churches and friendships, relationships, all that. That's an attack of the enemy for sure. When you read through the Gospels and you see Jesus healing people, oftentimes that's associated with demonic entities. That sickness is connected to the domain of darkness. And when Jesus casts out demonic entities from people, they got healed. So that's associated with that. But what I want to talk about is I want us to go deeper. Those are all real and present realities. But I want us to just take the maybe break the box a little bit and let's think outside the box to things to other ways that maybe the enemy is trying to attack humanity. And over the next couple of episodes, this is where I want to get into the subject of the occult, of witchcraft, of sorcery, of wizardry, of enchantments, Satanism, magic, because these are very generic terms, but underneath these various things is a whole bunch of stuff that's happening that the kingdom of darkness is unleashing, or the way the kingdom of darkness interacts in our world using people in ways that I don't even think most people are aware of or know. And one of those ways, I want to give one example in this episode, is astral projection gang stalking. Now, I guarantee some of you have never heard of that phrase before. I never heard of that phrase before until recently. I posted a video on YouTube a couple of months ago of an ex-Satanist who was a Satanist for years, got saved, met Jesus, and then she was sharing her testimony of what she used to do. And what this girl talked about blew my mind. And then I started reading in the comment section. There was like literally, there's over 1,000 comments on this video, but a lot of people were talking about or described what she was talking about as astral projection gang stalking, where this girl knew how to astral project, to go out of her body, take her spirit out of her body, travel in the spirit, and they would be assigned to go after certain Christians in the spirit and spiritually attack them, curse them, try to cause them harm in the spirit, while they sleep, or, while they're at work, or, while they're at school, or wherever. Like, just that happens. Now, that's a kind of warfare. That's a kind of attack. That's a kind of demonic force that most Christians is not even on their radar. How do you defend against that if you don't even think that that's real? Like, this is what blew my mind. That yes, the enemy is attacking us. Yes, he attacks us to sin, and he tries to wreak havoc in our lives and relationships and with people and churches. Yes, but there's a whole other level to that of attack that's gone completely under the radar and unnoticed, undetected in the church. But yet there's millions of people across the world who are involved in the dark arts. And we're going to get into practices and look at the stuff that is not just modern day, but it goes all the way back to Bible times. And it's in the Bible. There's dark arts, dark magic in the Bible itself that God addresses and warns against, practices of the enemy. That's real. And so many Christians today are just completely unaware, and you can't defend yourself if you don't even know what's coming against you. And I think there's a lot of Christians experience a lot of issues and a lot of difficulties in life because they're being attacked by ways that they don't even know exist. You can't pray against something if you don't even know it's a possibility of happening. How do you pray against astral projection gang stalking if you don't even know that that's a thing? How do you pray against that? And this is where I think that spiritual warfare, these spiritual forces of wickedness in heavenly places, this domain of darkness, this super intelligent malevolence, hive mind of unseen beings are operating, and they've controlled a lot of, and they've interacted with humanity, and now now have humans under their influence and control in such a way, doing things to God's people, to the world in general, and we're oblivious. And most people don't even know that it's actually a thing. And so this is why I think this subject is so important, that we have to be aware, especially as we get closer to the end. And when you look across our world and some of the stuff that's happening, and I'm going to get into this in upcoming episodes, these experiences that people are having and these testimonies of those who have been involved in the domain of darkness but have now met Jesus, and they're giving their testimony of what they've done and seen and experienced. Like, man, it's crazy. The war is so much more real and intense than we can imagine. And so spiritual warfare is real, but it's got multiple levels. And so often the church just stays on level one and is completely oblivious to these other levels of the way that the enemy is waging warfare against them. And so that's where we're going, and that's why I'm talking about this. Theologian by the name of John Blanchard says this. He says, for the Christian, this world is an arena, not an armchair. And I'm addressing this stuff because we are in a fight and a battle, and it's not time as Christians to sit back, lean back, put our arms up, and do nothing. We do that, you're done. You open yourself up to a whole bunch of stuff. But especially as we get closer to the end, man, like, this war is real. And this is an ancient war. It's an ancient battle that's manifested for thousands of years through history. through ancient civilizations and nations and God's people all throughout the centuries, now up to our modern day. It's still happening. And it's happening in ways that are not even on our radar. And so this is why I'm talking about this episode, and why I want to continually talk about this for the upcoming episodes, talking about the different strategies, the different ways of warfare that the enemy is coming at Christians with, it's coming at our world with, so that we can know how to fight, know how to pray, so that we can exercise our spiritual authority in Jesus. As Paul says, our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but it's against principalities and powers, so that we know how to effectively pray and battle principalities and powers, to battle that domain of darkness and actually fight with power and fight with purpose and fight with a godly strategy and wisdom, so that we can see his kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven. Well, that's it for episode 40. Again, I feel like I hope that this made sense. I hope it was somewhat coherent. I feel like there are certain parts maybe I wish I could have explained a bit better, but please let me know in the comment section if you have any questions. If you want me to explain something further, be happy to start a dialogue with you, because I'm passionate about this subject. I think it's so important, and I just want to make sure I am communicating it the best that I possibly can. So let me know if you have any questions, you want me to explain something further. And yeah, that's episode 40. Thanks so much for watching, listening, and we'll see you all in the next one. Much love, and God bless.